Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg, and our subject today, affairs and repairs. Can you repair a marriage after an affair is over? And if so, how do you do it? Of course, when we are talking about marriage, we're also being inclusive of gay and lesbian relationships and any committed relationship. With us is Deborah Hoffman. She's a psychologist, a past UW faculty member, a trainer, and presently an instructor of courses in win-win relationships. She's been counseling couples for over 30 years. Hey, thanks for being with us, Deborah. Good to see you. You know, we all have an idea of what an affair is, but maybe it'd be good if we began by you telling us what you think an affair includes.
Well, I think most people think of an affair as a situation in which people are sexual with each other, but we're discovering that it really has much more to do with where you are putting your intimate energy, whether it's emotional energy or sexual energy.
What would be an example of a non-sexual affair?
Some people seem to have an affair with golf, for example. Or
I'm guilty. Okay.
But the ones that we're thinking about here today are those where basically people have their concerns and their fears and their emotional energy directed toward someone other than their spouse or the person in their primary relationship.
Well, now, let's say you have a really good friend, and you talk to that friend, and I suppose this is true with some women. They're on the phone more with their women friends, maybe with their husband. He's not too verbal. Is that an affair?
Usually not. The distinction is when the energy really does get sucked out of the primary relationship. Sometimes when you have a friend and can work things out with that person, it helps because you can figure out what's important to you and so on. But we always say that it's wonderful to be married to your best friend, and this is one of the reasons. You would go to your best friend, and your best friend would also be your spouse.
I wasn't expecting to go here, but it seems to me there's a lot of marriages, maybe I'm stereotyping, where men aren't real talkers. They don't talk about feelings too much. They don't care. They think the woman's department. Is that kind of doomed for the woman to have an affair?
Not necessarily. It depends on what they do have. If they have a great deal of fun together, if they find good ways to meet those emotional needs, we're really talking about different kinds of intimacy.
Okay.
So they need to be connected, not just living parallel lives.
All right. So an affair has to do with intimacy, striking out and being intimate with someone, perhaps more so than you are with your spouse.
Right, and there are different forms. So for some people, and the stereotype is that this is more for men, that that intimacy is the sexual contact. It can also be internet sexual contact or work.
Wait a minute. Do you mean not touching each other, but on the internet you're being sexual?
Right, because it takes the sexuality out of the marriage, or at least substantially changes it.
Yes, and so you can't have sex on the internet, sort of.
Right, exactly. Okay. And that has actually been an interesting concept a lot of psychologists have talked about recently, is how threatening to a primary relationship is the internet when it's used that way.
Oh boy. You know, I wasn't expecting to get into this kind of detail, and I wanted to hear about the internet in this, but let me kind of flush out a few possibilities. Clearly, if you're in a chat room, you meet somebody, you start talking to them, and you have intimate conversations, and then you're face-to-face on the internet. I can see that. But what about if, take a man typically, is involved in pornography on the internet and gets enamored with some site? Is that a violation of the marriage? Is that close to what you're talking about?
Generally speaking, if pornography is a significant part of the sexuality, it is one that should be shared by the couple. Okay. And if both feel comfortable with that and the kind of sexuality. For example, there are some pornographies that very much put down women or various other sorts of things. So it's important that both kind of check in with themselves and say, is this really okay with me, and then use it together.
Use it together. What if the guy doesn't want anything to do with the woman using it with him? He just likes to look at pictures of women who to him look better than his wife.
Well, the question is how often and for what purpose he uses pornography. And just for a general sense of things, we try to say if it's more frequent than once a week, it becomes a significant dependency.
You know, this could be a program all by itself, but why don't we move to the traditional affair?
Okay.
One of the spouses has a romance and sexuality, the old-fashioned kind, face-to-face person to person. How common is that old-fashioned, well, pre-computer affair?
Way back in the olden days.
Right.
We have no idea. And the reason we don't know is not everybody will tell us, and we know that. It even happens in therapy or in courses on relationships where people are trying to fix their relationship or get more satisfaction from their relationship without ever really discussing the fact that they are using some exterior resource to meet their sexual needs.
You've been couples counseling for a long time. And I know you don't know this, but guess. How often do you think you've been sitting with a couple and one of them's having an affair, but you don't know it, and the, what's the word, not victim, what do you call the person?
The hurt partner.
The hurt partner doesn't know it. How often do you think that's happened to you as a...
I think it happens fairly frequently, although at some point, fairly shortly after the beginning of that couples therapy, many times what will happen is that the betraying partner, the unfaithful partner, will find a reason not to come back. And it's some other reason, I'm too busy, and I don't mean to scare people. Some people really can't schedule it, etc. But they'll find ways to say, I can't handle getting to this conversation. And one thing, we know that somewhere around 40% of individuals admit to having been unfaithful at some point. And at this point, it seems as if men and women, at least those who admit to it, are about the same number.
Really?
And then the question is, how often do people admit that they're actually in an affair at this time?
Do you think or have any knowledge about, is it more likely men have affairs or women?
Well, we believe that men have more affairs than women, or more often are those individuals who do. And the reason may be that for a fair number of men who have affairs, it really is a sexual involvement. It may be something for their self-esteem, something to feel young again, or whatever the case may be. Whereas, again, stereotypically, women tend to look for emotional, I was going to say vulnerability. Everybody ends up vulnerable if they're in this situation, but connections and the emotional intimacy that they may lack at home.
Okay. When you talk about triggers to this, I'm hearing a couple triggers. For a woman, you're saying lack of emotional intimacy. For a man, is it really the same thing, but he goes after sex, or is it other triggers for men?
Well, in the end, it ends up being frequently the same for both. For example, a woman who has heard recently from an old flame from high school may want to feel young and attractive again, and so it sort of would flip over to what we usually think of as the male reason. And for a man, very often what happens is, once the children are taking up a whole lot of energy for both parents, but the question is, where is sexuality on their priority list? If it's too low, and they don't have fun together, and they don't remember why they used to connect, and to try to do that again, there will be a further and further distance between the two of them.
Is sexuality sort of the fall guy for affairs or for marriage problems, where people say, well, it's all about sex. I wasn't having adequate or satisfying sex, and that's kind of a dummy issue, or really kind of a symptom of the real problem, or is it really the symptom? That's the issue?
It's one of many, actually, because once people get down to it, the problem is often that their own self-esteem, all of us could use some additional self-esteem, I'm sure, but that they're feeling like they're not getting enough from their partner, and that's in both directions, male and female. That they're not feeling the way they felt when they first fell in love and when they planned their lives together and so on. Of course, some people are unfaithful very early in the relationship. And that's just the way they want to play, rather than looking at what their own historical issues are, what they learned about relationships, and especially how to, deal with some of the harder times and still be okay. The maturity of being able to do that is important.
Oh boy, a lot of questions come to my mind as you talk. One of them is the affair usually relationship-based, i.e. the relationship's just not working as well as they had hoped or whatever, or is it really... and you could have told before the marriage started, Bill or Sarah, they're going to have an affair because there's something that is in their own being, in their own psychological makeup, triggers for having an affair?
Well, there are lots and lots of triggers, but the question that really comes up is, will they act on them? So watching somebody attractive walk down the street, I've heard from many couples, we both turn and look. And so it's a question of whether or not before the marriage those individuals have seen that they can enjoy the idea of sexuality without actually taking action that will harm their partner or their relationship. That we can't see ahead.
Let me hypothesize. Someone gets into a marriage thinking, this will make me happy. But at 26, their life has been pretty unhappy. They've always felt a little empty, a little unsatisfied, always searching. Isn't that person more likely to have an affair than a person who doesn't have those issues and gets into a marriage?
If they decide that having an affair will do more than perhaps pump up their adrenaline. Some people really do have what seems like an affair with golf or with something else, and it's very important to them to have some sense of their own worth and fill that empty spot with something. And the question is how much they actually need it to be relational. Because it's fun to go out and play golf, but you don't necessarily hear very much from your golf partners, perhaps, or from playing the game.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is that really you can't look at the individual before marriage and say this person's more likely to have an affair. It has to do with their commitment to just not doing it, no matter how appealing it may seem.
Right. We know that in part from cultures where you're going to have something inappropriate cut off if you end up being caught with in an affair. And so it really has to do with cost.
You're talking about people cut off your arm or something?
It could be your hands. It could be any part of you. In some parts of the world, it's your nose. Because that has to do apparently with your family honor and that sort of thing. And so the question is whether or not there is enough reason not to take action. It's really, it's like spending money or something else. Is the cost larger or the benefit? And you compare the two and make a decision.
This is kind of changing my beliefs, or it's against what I would believe. I mean, I would have to believe a person who's insecure and needs validation from another person is more likely to have an affair than a person who's really very centered and happy with themselves and so on. And you're saying, no, if you make a commitment to not doing it no matter how you feel, that's the big issue.
Well, that is ultimately the thing that makes a difference in their action.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they mightn't be very distant within the marriage. Perhaps they spend all their time fiddling with something in the garage or going out and seeing friends or doing something else that they're interested in. But the question is, ultimately, if someone chooses to have an affair or a one-night stand, or a lot of people do this on business trips and that sort of thing, what is it that is going to be gained in their mind, and how much will it take away from them? And so if they think they're not going to get caught, then it may seem like...
Why not? Okay, so what's your advice? You're dealing with an individual in counseling, and she says to you, I'm feeling a little guilty because I've had about 7 one-night stands on business trips. What should I do?
Well, if they're in individual counseling and they haven't just said that in front of their spouse.
No, your client, individual.
Then the question is, why do they need to do that? Because it is filling some sort of need. If they brought it to counseling, or if they bring it to a friend, or if they're really concerned about it and are reading up on it and that sort of thing, then there's something that doesn't fit for them about that. So you've already gotten into the conversation of what are you trying to get that you're not getting.
Yeah.
It's like eating that way. If you keep eating something that isn't satisfying you and you keep eating that, you're still not going to be satisfied no matter what you do.
I see. Well, is it possible? Some person might say, my marriage is fine, they're my good friends, stuff like that, but sex is just mediocre. And it's not worth it to me to bring it up because I know she is just not very sexual. I've learned that about them. But I love them. But, I feel better when I have sex on a trip once in a while. And, what is there anything wrong with me? Is it possible that could be okay?
It can be okay. The question is whether it's up front in the marriage and discussed, And if it's very, very clear to the spouse who is not as sexual that they're cared for and that you're committed to them, and that it's really okay with them.
You're saying if it's discussed. Well, so you're saying this person should bring it up, even if they're doing okay having the affair. They're not troubled by it. Their spouse doesn't know.
I would have real questions about whether they're not troubled by it.
Oh, really?
For one thing, I do want to point out that there are people who are very sexual and very happy, emotionally and sexually, in their marriage or primary relationship, and still are very sexual outside of that marriage. And so the question is it an addiction? What is the question that's leading them to sort of hide out from themselves with that kind of behavior? Because, for one thing, you may well be hurting someone else and their marriage.
Yes.
And the question is, why are you willing to take high-risk behaviors?
Then that's a good question. If you did take these high-risk behaviors and you think, I'm done, or you had an affair for 6 months and you realized, I was really dumb, and I'm not in love with that other woman, it's my wife or husband, and you haven't told your spouse, can you bury it, move on, and just never mention it?
Well, that is a point of contention among people who think about this quite a bit. It's not that you should tell per se, but the chance of your being able to have a truly emotionally intimate relationship with anyone from whom you have secrets is very small. And so you're saying, I prefer to live a parallel life rather than an emotionally satisfying one with my spouse.
I remember in a program I did with two therapists, I asked this question years ago, and one said, absolutely, just like what you're saying, Deborah, you can't have intimacy with such a huge secret. The other person said, absolutely not, the other marriage therapist. He said, why are you telling her, if it's a guy, you're telling her to get rid of your guilt. Not for her. You're telling it for you. If you really loved her, you'd keep your mouth shut and not hurt her.
And that is the question. If you are either telling about the affair or giving lots of, the affair has come out in whichever way it has, and then there are questions and details, for whom is that being done? If the hurt spouse or the would-be hurt spouse needs that information, and in order for that connection to be repaired, then it's got to be done in a way that works for that individual. For example, we don't usually want to have lots of visual information because that visual information is very hard to get rid of in the listener.
Right.
So it's a question of whether the person who is giving the information is really truly doing it to maintain their marriage or relationship and to assist the hurt individual, or whether it is to relieve themselves of guilt.
So this brings you to your office and a couple coming in where the affair is out in the open and over, I assume. Has to be over.
Sometimes.
Well, tell us about that. You see a couple and an affair is still going on. How can you help them?
Well, there are two possibilities, at least. One is the affair is going on and they both know it, and the other is that the affair is going on and it's a secret.
From you two?
Very often.
Yeah.
Yep,
well, you wouldn't know it, so how can you work on helping them repair that?
Exactly. Now, it's not by any means impossible to work on the marriage with that secret, but there will remain what some writers have spoken of as being like a small, like little blue robin's egg that's very delicate, and you always have to protect it. You always know you have a secret, and so that maintains distance. You can't just be who you truly are with the individual.
The betraying partner is the secret, but the other person might be fine.
As far as they know. But usually, it's amazing how often people know, and they don't let themselves know that they know. It's true of children in a marriage with an affair as well. Very often, the children have an inkling about what's going on, or even actual information. Kids these days can get on, websites and email and Facebook and all that stuff, and people sometimes think that they've erased information that isn't really gone, and the kids know about it and they don't know what happens if they're to tell anyone, so usually they don't tell.
That's a tough thing.
Yeah, it's actually very corrosive in a lot of ways. Very often what will happen is that the hurt partner thinks they're doing well and feels strong and so on, but they're sort of waiting for the partner to come back. They think that the person is depressed or working very hard or whatever it is, and so they're sort of on hold. And that
this is the
doesn't
hurt
last forever.
partner.
The hurt partner.
What are the tells, as they say in poker, for that partner to intuitively know something is wrong? I at some level she knows there's an affair going on, even if it's not even conscious. What are the tells she's getting from her partner or his partner?
Well, generally speaking, I think it has to do with your gut response. If
Right.
you know this person is moving further and further away from you, what's that about?
Yes.
And if you're wrong and it's not an actual sexual affair, it's still better to see what's needed and how to reconnect. Because one of the things we forget about frequently is that the betraying partner, the unfaithful partner, is hurt too. And so that person...
Oh? Well, what do you mean?
Well, that person has a reason for going outside the marriage. And they may feel, for example, after one or more children, and the mom, if we're going to be stereotypic again, is spending a lot of energy, and it's necessary for children to grow up. They need a lot of energy. But then if the sexuality is put on the bottom of the priority list, a lot of times the self-esteem of the person who becomes unfaithful is very low.
Wow. Carl Whitaker, the father of family therapy, used to say, the person who's having the affair is nominated by the hurt party to have an affair. Of course, not directly. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, in the sense that we often see an individual who is the hurt partner allowing the distance to get bigger and bigger. And we say, for whatever reasons, I'm not going to recognize my own fallibility here, my own ways in which I'm telling you that you're less important, not being as sexual as perhaps we've agreed would feel good for both of us, but I withhold in some way, or even completely unconsciously to say, if you want more, whether it's sexuality or intimacy, go find it somewhere. I'm busy.
Okay. So they're in your office. Here comes a couple, and let us say the affair comes out in your first session. Now what? What are your steps?
Well, if it's the very first session, what we're going to be dealing with is shock. And so it's a good idea not to make major decisions when you're in shock.
Oh, okay, so it comes out at that session. Okay.
If what we know from often before the first session, people call up and say, one of us has been having an affair and we need to come in and work on that. One of the rules of thumb is if you're still in the affair, there is going to be a split in your energy. And
Yes.
there's a secret, and it makes people feel crazy if they have a sense that something's going on, but when they ask, the party who's doing that denies it.
Sure. But now in comes this couple, and before we even go into the details, what are the chances this marriage is going to work out after an affair? It's been admitted.
Well, if both want to work on it, and if the betraying partner is willing to completely let go of any relationship with the other party,
Right.
then it tends to be about 30% of
30%.
marriages, they say. Again, we don't really know because people don't put this out on their front porch. But that about 30% of the marriages stay together and are fully
So
intimate.
70% don't make it. They come
Well,
to
they
you
don't
and-
make it in one way or another. It may be that they make a deal, silently or otherwise, we're not getting into this. It's too uncomfortable for me. Sometimes there's been sexual abuse or something else very significant, a loss in childhood. And so they both agree, kind of collude with, we're not going back to therapy. It's too scary.
Okay, yeah.
And so they may stay together, but they're not close.
Okay, so they come in to see you. You roll up your sleeves. Where do you begin?
Well, I often start with, why did you choose this person in the beginning? What's good about the relationship? What attracted you? And that's important because that's at some level what you want to get back to and remember and sort of fill out more fully so that you can, we love to talk, we love to really feel listened to, we love to feel taken care of, whatever the original things were. But usually it's fun and it's connective, and we want that. And so we want to build some positives back in.
But that sounds like the hurt person, I keep wanting to say the victim, is they're saying, well, we want this to work. It's too bad that she had an affair, but let's have it work. It seems to me there'd be a lot to get through to get to that point.
Yes, and when people feel like we're ignoring the real issues, oh no, just go have fun, don't talk about the affair, then they're not going to get anywhere. So we're really talking about several levels of awareness here. So I would say to them, for example, we will get to all of these levels. And I know that the hurt is immense, and that even the guilt on the feelings of guilt on the part of the betrayer, etc., have to be dealt with, because we can't just leave those and say, well, you were a bad kid, and so you deal with it. But we need something to build on. So we might say, let's talk about it in the therapy. Let's have you have some fun with each other. For example, seeing a movie, so you don't have to talk all the time, but you could share the experience.
But isn't the hurt person seething while they're sitting at the movie? He's having fun, or she's having fun, but I'm still the victim here. How do you get rid of that?
It does take time, and one thing for both of them to be aware of is it can take up to 2 years or longer for that immense sensitivity to sort of ebb away, and it takes a recognition on the part of both partners that they need to rebuild trust and find genuine forgiveness. That doesn't mean let's pretend that you didn't do it. It's the awareness that it occurred, and I recognize why you do the self-exploration that you need, and I'll do the self-exploration that I need, hopefully in front of each other in the therapy sessions. I see that the pain came up for you in a very real and significant way when we started talking about, how your parents treated you, or what happened when they died, or whatever. And I see that the pain was what was being dealt with here.
You're talking about the person's individual pain?
Both. Mm-hmm.
It would seem to me important to get to why the affair happened, what was going on or lacking in the relationship, in order to allow possibility of forgiveness or some closure that doesn't make the finger pointing so strong as you betrayed me, period.
It will almost always be that strong. At least during some point early in that. It might not be right at first. Again, the shock might have taken over. But it kind of goes through the stages of grieving that we talk about when someone dies. And there is, in fact, a death of innocence, a death of that early relationship. In other words, these two people have to decide that they want to build on the original relationship, but to build a new one. And many people describe it as being much more intimate and much more real and much more satisfying after the fact.
Because now you really, really know the other person.
That's right, and you really, really know yourself. I think people hold on to their foibles and their faults, and then they have to let them go. Because
if he's the perp, he's going to have to say, well, part of the reason I did this is because you never want to have sex, or you never want to talk, or whatever, and then the spotlight can move to her to self-explore, as well as to him, for why he did this and what he's lacking, and so on.
Right, and what we want to teach people really early in this process is that if you attack, you'll get defense back.
Yes. And
so if what you want is for the person to tell you what's wrong with you and accuse you and so on of that, then you can attack them. Otherwise, it makes sense to say, I feel like attacking. I can't see at this point how it's my fault. I didn't step outside the marriage, etc., but I need to ask this in a way that isn't purely accusatory. Otherwise, I won't get any information and there won't be any growth.
Okay. So, at some point, how do you gain forgiveness for you? What are the steps in forgiving the other partner?
It actually requires a lot more openness than we might be comfortable with. Person being available and accessible. I have a cartoon in my office.
Are you talking about the betrayer or the betrayee?
Both have to be.
Okay.
Because if I'm very angry with you but I'm not admitting it as the hurt person, then you're working on a false premise as well. So in both directions, people have to be open about it. I always say that one of the worst lies that people tell in marriages is to say, I'm fine, when they're not fine.
Okay, so this is why you say the marriage might, if it's successful, this process, be more intimate than it ever was.
Exactly. In fact, it's almost impossible that it not be, unless they've colluded and said, let's just keep going on our parallel tracks.
Okay, so ideally, let's say she had the affair, and he sees after 12 sessions with you how emotionally closed down he was the whole marriage after the courting was over and they got married, and he starts changing. And he can say, honey, I forgive you because you needed. No wonder. So you ever have these wonderful, clear outcomes?
Yes, and then the next week, that does actually make a big difference. Forgiveness has to do not with being good or doing it because you're supposed to or whatever, but actually seeing that the other person is letting go of some of those beliefs or relationships that got in the way of the marriage, and bringing that friendship to the top of the priority list. The sexuality, the intimacy, and the conversation, and to say, I will not do this again, and I will let you know whatever you need to know, and you can find me no matter where I am. I will interrupt meetings. I will be accessible to you.
Wow, so this is really interesting. I never thought of it this way. So you get, hopefully, an even better marriage than you had at the beginning.
I wouldn't prescribe it for that reason, but yes, that tends to happen.
Wow. Would you do a study for us? Look at people who have had an affair, gone to marriage counseling, and now they're still together, and see if they're happier than the average couple. What would you guess?
I would guess that the people who stay together and continue to have fun with each other and repair all of those things, high percentage are happier.
Wow.
And sometimes it's specific things like sexuality brings up the equivalent of adrenaline in people, which is also true with danger and newness. And so if we can have some of that in our relationship, I've seen people go out and learn to ride motorcycles together, or bungee jumping, as I like to say, whatever version of that actually interests them. But when you have more adrenaline flowing with that person, not just because of them, but while you're both doing something that feels new and maybe just a touch dangerous. I'm not suggesting people go out and play with knives, but that they actually bond more.
If they had gone to a therapist like yourself before they got married, and they said, examine our marriage for us, could this have saved this whole thing from happening?
It could. And the question is whether people who are in love and looking forward to all kinds of possibilities can really examine where their own fears are and their own ways of defending themselves against their feelings. So I don't want to feel my feelings, so I'm going to go out and do something exciting. And also, certainly, if people have done this before, the chances are much higher that they will do it again.
Wow. The higher they'll have an affair again?
Yes.
If they don't go to marriage counseling.
Well, I hope. The marriage counseling is to deal with this.
So it won't happen again.
Right.
Any idea of the recidivism rate of the person after marriage counseling and they stay together? Will they do it again?
What it seems to follow is whether or not they have actually dealt with their issues, their personal issues. Where did it come from? What are they trying to, what needs are they trying to meet?
I see.
And because people will feel like that again.
Right.
We all feel various ways, and sometimes we feel ugly and stupid, and sometimes we feel strong and adventurous. There are lots of ways in which people take action that's inappropriate. So it's a question of whether or not people are willing to actually grapple with those. And again, the maturity of being able to say, not everything stays happy all the time, but I'll stick around. Or sometimes I need to learn some things that I don't know, and I guess I've stumbled across something else I need to grow with. Can you help me?
Is it safe to say that people are, as a group, fairly uneducated about what to expect in a marriage when they get in? And if they knew more, this would be less likely?
I think that may be more true of what it's like to have a new baby. Or in some cases a new job or whatever, where something takes the energy away.
Yeah.
But I think that the problem is that when we marry, often we have such lovely dreams. And we have generally been with the person through the good times. So what we are missing is the information about how we as individuals can handle the hard times.
Well, I've heard so often people say that there should be a course on how to have a child before you have one, and you should get a license and at least have a few hours of education. I think the same is true with marriage.
I think it would be wonderful. I think a few hours would not be enough, because there's lots to be said about how to handle something that's challenging. But I do think that it involves looking at what that individual is trying to deal with that they haven't. So that's the therapy end. And sometimes, I mean, we can have therapy in life. You don't have to be in the therapy room. But if you read and look and ask people you're close to, where do you see my challenges and my obstacles? Sometimes people can explore their way through those.
Well, and again, we have not only run out of time, we've gone over time because there's so much to say here, but I think it's been very interesting, and it certainly enlightened me some of the things I kind of misperceived about the outcome being really pretty positive if you can get through it. And I thank you very much for being with us, Deborah, and I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights.